I'd like to thank the Creator for this beautiful day. Thank the Creator for this beautiful territory that we live in. Ask the Creator to watch over all of our friends and family, all our communities, carry them through these troubled times. Ask the Creator to lay a special blessing on our elders and our infirmed. Give them strength to carry on. Also ask the Creator to give strength to all the people that helped organize this and those that chose to participate, because this is the Creator is placing a great work in your hands, a great work to bring forward for Mother Earth. Ask the Creator to watch over each and every one of you from this day forward. Oshim.
Thanks so much, Erik. And I want to invite everyone joining from other places to take a moment to consider and honor the history of stewardship and the cultural heritage of that place. So let's just take a second to think about that.
So you should be seeing my screen while people are still arriving. Maybe I'll give a little bit of background on myself. And so I'm talking to you from Gabriola Island, so another one of the Gulf Islanders here, and getting used to doing all of this virtual meetings. It's still rather strange. I'm much more used to getting up and talking to large rooms full of people, but there you go. We're all in a virtual large room here. So. And probably in some ways we're in prettier places than we would be if we were in a big meeting room in a hotel. So I'll take it. I've been working in forestry for more than 40 years. Started as a tree planter and then done many, many other things. And a lot of that time was spent, a significant piece of the time was spent doing silviculture surveys, which essentially is looking at how trees regrow in British Columbia here. Are they regrowing, what needed to be done, and so on. So I got a decade, more than a decade of just experience of looking at ecosystems and how they were performing. And then I really brought that into carbon when carbon started happening. I've been working in carbon, well, since the beginning, really. Joseph was around with us then as well. And so I've written methodologies internationally and as well as in BC here, and have done projects and have looked at projects in areas, well, all over the globe, really, certainly from Malaysia, Zambia, Australia, Central America, and here in North America. So, yeah. And so today's talk is going to be really sort of going through the technicalities of how a carbon project comes to be. And some of this will be really basic for some of you, and some of it may not be, and some of it will be a little bit sarcastic, because sometimes we get snowed under in the technicalities. So I'm sort of going to run through all those technicalities and the vocabulary that goes with them, because that's a pretty important part of it. It's the usual thing. If you know how to talk the language, you're sort of halfway to knowing what you're doing. The other thing I'm going to say about this presentation, you will see there's not a single picture, graph, or chart in it. So that's a warning that it might be a little dry, but actually I don't think it's dry at all, actually. But I just thought it was funny as I put the thing together, realized that I wasn't putting any visuals in and really didn't have room for them. So yes, the subject of this is how to turn a piece of the ecosystem, whether it's a seaweed or a tree, into a carbon offset. And obviously the end goal of that typically is that we want to be able to sell that carbon offset and get money that will allow us to do the kinds of things that we need to do to change our ecosystems and to address climate change. And I think that's the one thing I'm going to emphasize from the beginning, is that we often think that the kind of good work that we need to do in our ecosystems necessarily is the same thing as the kind of good work we need to do to change the climate path that we're on. And they're not necessarily true. Sometimes we need to do good things in ecosystems that are actually negative for climate. So there's a caution there that we sort of tend to think that everything green goes together, but it isn't actually necessarily true. Okay, now, let's see here. So, just to interrupt, I think everybody knows this, but the issue about where is the carbon in the ecosystem, it's in biomass in various places. And the critical point I want to make here that you'll see throughout this slide is that I've highlighted in red whenever we're dealing with a piece of terminology that gets used in the carbon world. So these are the kind of terminology that's critical to know in order to be able to talk about this kind of stuff. And you can see here that, sorry, excuse me. You can see here that there are a number of pools, which these are the things that we specifically account when we do a project. But there are all kinds of other places, obviously, that carbon will go to. It's all captured by photosynthesis, but then it may go into living biomass, dead wood, litter. But it may also go into things like CO2 and CH4 and char, which aren't specifically accounted. Obviously, the CO2 is in terms of our global atmospheric carbon. But the things like charcoal aren't accounted unless they end up in the soil pool, for instance. And the other thing that we don't typically account, I'll talk a bit about that when we get to blue and green carbon, is buried carbon. That's where it's so deeply buried that, ultimately speaking, it might turn into a fossil fuel in another few 100 million years. And so we're often not really accounting for that, although with blue carbon, we'll see that sometimes we're thinking about it at least. But so these are the pools that we typically look at in any terrestrial project, let's say, and most blue projects as well. And the other thing I want to say about this, and I'll talk about this more later, is that there's huge differences in how much we know about these pools. And it depends on what ecosystem we're in. And so, for instance, if we're talking about a forest, we know a great deal actually about the living biomass, the above and below ground pools. We're pretty good at quantifying that. But when we get to the soils, we may have a great gap in knowledge scientifically. And this is a global gap. It's not just a gap, for us here or anything like that. But then soil tends to be, and then the other one that can be a bit mystifying is wood products. So that's basically if you have a forest and some of that forest is getting cut down, not all of that carbon gets emitted immediately. Some of it goes into 2x4s and paper and plywood. And the question of sort of how long does that carbon remain in those products before it goes back to the atmosphere? We have some research on that and we have some numbers, but again, can be a little bit gray. But I'd say the grayest one is always the soil, and that will turn out to be quite critical. Not so much for forests with most of the things we do with them, but hugely critical as soon as we're talking about grasslands, and fairly critical as soon as we're talking about blue carbon and wetland carbon and those sorts of things. So yes, that's the pools that we're dealing with here. And obviously our goal is to be able to do things that change that amount of carbon that's being stored there so that we don't have it in the atmosphere. And we all know that it's photosynthesis that gets it there, but the variability on how much gets there, when, and in what form is huge across ecosystems. We're looking at questions about the species, the temperature and moisture and nutrients in the system, cooperation and competition between plants on site. All of these things can have significant impacts on carbon and on the form that carbon is in. And for instance, with carbon that has been a plant and now has fallen as litter and now has decayed, the nature of the soil and the soil organisms may determine how long that carbon resides in the soil. And you can get what's called recalcitrant, I can't even say it, carbon, which is in a chemical form that's very resistant to decay and can be a long time resident in the soil. So the intricacies of the ecosystem are huge. And I'll give you an example of that. We know this is with grasslands now and cattle. We know that if we have, let's call it conventional cattle grazing on a site, that it tends to reduce the carbon in the ecosystem because the cattle are basically typically overgrazing. Unfortunately, many of our grazing systems have been overgrazing. And of course, then a lot of CH4 is getting emitted because the cattle are farting and burping. On the other hand, we also know that if we take that site, take all the cattle off of it and just have it be a native grassland with no cattle, that we actually don't get as much carbon either, because it is the case that at optimal grazing levels, The action of the cattle themselves helps to put carbon into the soil where it becomes more permanently held. And so there's this Goldilocks zone somewhere between no cows and too many cows, where you get optimal carbon storage in many grassland ecosystems. And where that Goldilocks zone is obviously very complicated and not always clear. So it's, we're dealing with very complicated ecological processes, and I'll talk about that maybe more in another presentation later. So yes, we all get the carbon cycle, we know that, but so then the question becomes, how do we get a carbon project? And so this is where we get these two, when we need to do something that increases the rate of carbon uptake or reduces the rate of carbon loss. It's got to be one of those two things. And it's got to meet these two key criteria, which are sort of keystones, I would say, to the whole carbon game, which is that it's additional. So that means it wouldn't have happened if we didn't do something, and we didn't do something that we would have done otherwise. In other words, if, for instance, a logging company cuts down trees, as they do, and they're required here in BC to replant, that replanting does not create a carbon project, because that's to be what would have happened anyhow. And then the other big key concept is that it's got to be quote unquote permanent, which doesn't mean forever and ever, but we typically take as meaning 100 years. So that doesn't, however, mean that, for instance, if you're saving a given tree, it has to be there for the whole 100 years. It means that the project as a whole has to increase the amount of carbon and keep that increase over a 100-year period. But that carbon could be moving around between trees, in a sense, in the project area as time goes on. So it's a matter of every time you claim that carbon has been saved, that carbon continues to be saved for the next 100 years, but it may move around within your project ecologically and in different pools. So yeah. And then what are we talking about when we say do something? So, these are sort of classic examples that really come from forestry, but they also apply to other types. So we've got afforestation. So that's basically planting trees where there haven't been trees for a long time. And the same thing would be the case of, say, an eelgrass meadow. If you've got an area that maybe was eelgrass, 800 years ago, and then, somebody boomed logs in the area or whatever happened, and the eelgrass was lost, that's essentially an afforestation. In that case, it's not forestry, it's an eelgrass, but it's basically bringing back a piece of the ecosystem that captures carbon. Then we get this sometimes weird issue between afforestation and reforestation, which I won't go into because it's a bit artificial. But basically, in any case here, you're adding plants on site that will photosynthesize and then presumably capture that carbon in one form or another. The other one, obviously, the other instance of that is conservation, where you're saving something that would otherwise be damaged. So logging old growth would be an example of that. If you can save old growth, you're clearly saving that carbon on site. Then the third type is this improved management type, usually improved forest management when it's forestry. This is where you're not doing something so simple as just planting something or stopping, say, logging from happening, but where you're changing how it happens. And so, like, I've worked on the Cheakamus community forest up in Whistler, along with some of the other people that are here in this room, I think. And a lot of what we were doing there was some conservation, but a lot of it was improved forest management, where we were looking at longer rotation ages and stuff like that. So in other words, saying that instead of cutting a tree down at age 80, we're going to save it to age 120. And then we may cut it down at that point, but we're getting bigger trees. We're actually getting more valuable lumber. And at the same time, we're also keeping more carbon on the landscape for longer. And again, that's one of those cases where the carbon is going to rotate. You are going to cut the tree down, but in the meantime, another tree is getting older and capturing that carbon, and again, being kept longer. So all of that, does increase the carbon on the landscape. So, just to be clear, that what we're saying is that carbon projects don't have to mean no human activity beyond, say, planting. In other words, there can be ongoing human activity, because we do use wood and we do need some of these things, but still have a carbon benefit. And then, there's this whole concept called RED+, which is reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation plus. And I'm a little sarcastic about this because it's sort of a catch-all acronym that ends up meaning not very much. But I'll give you an example of a project that I worked on that was a classic RED+ project. This was in Zambia in Africa. And what we were doing there was we were teaching local farmers to use trees as part of their agriculture. These were nitrogen fixing trees. So they improved their soil, they captured carbon. They also improved their agricultural output substantially. We were quadrupling their incomes from a very low level, I will say. And in so doing, we were capturing carbon, and we were also then, because their agriculture was more efficient, we were then able to save other parts of the ecosystem for wildlife habitat, basically. And this is an area that's right next to one of the great African parks that has every great African animal you can imagine in it. And so saving that wildlife habitat, and it had spin-off benefits, things like reducing poaching, because people didn't need to go poaching because now their farms were more productive. So that's a sort of a classic red plus, where you're doing some soil, you're doing some trees, you're having some other impacts, you're doing some conservation, all in one project. So it does have a meaning, but to me, it's a bit nebulous sometimes, and I get tired of the acronyms. So as I say here, that's the increasing in the amount of carbon. That was the easy-ish part. Now we get into the complicated part, because, and I'm going to go through, and again, I'm probably going to be a little sarcastic about this, because this looks like a huge series of very expensive steps, and it is, that you have to go through from the moment where you've decided what you're going to do to add carbon in the landscape to the point that you have carbon offsets to sell. And despite my sort of sarcasm, because sometimes I get a little tired of working my way through all these systems, the truth of the matter is that these are all really necessary in order to ensure that, again, the ecosystem work that we do actually does benefit the atmosphere, which after all is the goal of a carbon project. We may have other goals, but that's the ultimate goal from a carbon point of view. So the first question that comes up is what accounting or regulatory system are we going to do this under? And that's a major choice in its own right, because there's very different standards, and there's very different expected outcomes in terms of dollars that are associated with these. And so, for instance, here in BC, we have Greenhouse Gas Industrial Reporting and Control Act. I think I've got that right. Anyhow, GERCA, another acronym. And there are potentially carbon projects under that, and that has been in the past actually one of the more lucrative areas, because the BC government was paying more money than was being paid on many of the international markets. That's changing now. But then we have the coming Canadian Carbon Registry, so that's the Government of Canada one. And by the looks of things, but again with some questions about how exactly it's going to work, that one's going to be a quite high dollar value site where they're looking for very high quality offsets that will really reduce Canada's emissions to meet its Paris Accord targets. And then we have international standards like the Verified Carbon Standard. Used to be the Voluntary Carbon Standard, which tells you what it actually is. And that's a standard that's used really for people who voluntarily want to offset their emissions. And so it's been used by a lot of major corporations. And it's a very credible standard. It's probably in some ways the grandfather of standards now, but it's also one where you're not likely to make as much money, because these are voluntary offsets. And as soon as you're in the voluntary world, people aren't going to pay as much as when it's in a government program. So, or a government program that's designed to actually reduce national emissions. So that's the standard. So you would choose a standard, and obviously, ideally here in Canada, if you had the right kind of project and some other things which we'll talk about, you'd go to the Canadian Carbon Registry, just because that's where the rubber hits the road in terms of Paris Accords and in terms of dollars. So the next step will be you need a methodology. A methodology is essentially the thing that tells you what do you have to do in order to account the offsets, and in order to prove that the project meets all of the requirements of the registry. And the problem right now for us here in BC and Canada is that we actually don't have any methodologies active at this moment under the BC or Canada systems that address our blue or green carbon. We used to have a forest one here in BC, and we supposedly have one coming, but it hasn't hit the ground yet. Government of Canada is working on a forest one, but it hasn't hit the ground yet. So we're actually in a weird period right now where if you do a project, you actually don't have a methodology, and therefore you really can't do all the rest of the steps I'm about to talk about. That should change in the next year. And I expect we'll get past this. We do have methodologies under VCS and other voluntary standards. So if you're starting a project, you wanted to get a feel for what you want to do, you could certainly look at those methodologies and go, okay, that's sort of what I'm going to have to do, and go from there. And the one thing I will say is that we do under VCS, under the Verified Carbon Standard, there actually is a BC specific standard there. It's the old BC standard, BC Forest Carbon Offset Protocol, which is no longer active in BC, but it was turned into a international standard at one point. I actually did the work on that. And so that still sits there. And so that gives you a real idea, that gives you a real idea of sort of what that might look like for something in BC. Then the next question is the baseline. So in other words, you always want to know what would have happened if I didn't do the project. And this can be pretty complicated because it's a counterfactual. So you're saying what would have happened but didn't. And you have to be able to demonstrate that this is real and that you're not just saying, you're not saying, for instance, let's take an example. You're not taking a piece of land that hasn't been logged in 100 years and is privately owned and nobody wants to log and saying, oh, it would all be logged and therefore we're saving a whole bunch of carbon by not logging it. That would be a question where the baseline would clearly be questioned. They go, no, the owner has no intention of logging it. Why are you saying that? So there's got to be reasonable proof that your baseline is credible. And the other word that you're going to come up here a lot here is conservative. In other words, that it doesn't overestimate the carbon benefits. So if anything, we tend to err on the other side and underestimate a bit, or in other words, essentially overestimate how much carbon would be there under the baseline. There are some systems where you have a predetermined baseline. California is an example of that. In Canada, I think is considering that. I haven't heard yet whether they're going to go that way or not. That obviously makes your job a lot easier. They basically say, in your ecosystem, we expect you to have X amount of carbon in this type of forest or stand or site. And if you do better than that, you've earned carbon offsets. Whether they're actually going to do that here, I don't know. And then keep in mind that this is also looking at all of the carbon across the entire project area. So that's the actual geographic area that you're working in all of those pools that we talked about earlier, with the exception that sometimes some of the pools are really, there's no change. And so we get to ignore them. And a classic example of that in forestry in BC is soil carbon. Typically, everything we do in BC here in terms of different forest management types doesn't change the soil carbon so materially that we have to account it, which is actually a relief because it's very hard to account. Then we do the same thing for the project. In other words, we say what we're going to do and we guess how much carbon we're actually going to save by doing that. So this is sort of before the fact, before you started doing the project. You need to estimate what your benefits are going to be. And obviously, you do that both so the regulator knows, but also so that you know whether it's even worth putting in all the work that it's going to take to turn what you've done on the landscape into offsets. Because if at this point you say, well, I'm only going to generate 2,000 offsets by doing all this, you're probably stopping right there. So this is an early stage that's both required, but also good management. Then we calculate what's called leakage, which is the amount of carbon that will be released somewhere else because of what you do. And forestry is a classic example of this. If we save 10,000 hectares of old growth, is somebody going to go and log somewhere else to create those 2x4s? If so, we may not have saved much carbon, or we may have saved quite a bit if the site they're going to log has lower carbon density than the one we're saving. But we need to be able to quantify that, and this is obviously complicated because we're talking about economics here. And classically, for instance, if there's sort of two possible cases, the 2x4 case is probably the classic case where the market is going to get its wood from somewhere. And so if we're not stopping forests from being chopped down and we're not creating 2x4s, somebody else probably is going to create them. There probably still is some carbon benefit if we're dealing with an old growth forest, but there's going to be a lot of leakage in that regard. The other extreme might be, let's say, boat grade yellow cedar, where we've got a big area like some of the Great Bear, for instance, where there's a lot of yellow cedar, or actually some of Cheakamus as well. And we're not going to log that. Well, there's just not other supplies of yellow cedar out there where we pretty much know where it all is. And so probably that means that that there's going to be less yellow cedar produced. What that does, of course, is drive the price up, which then may drive somebody else to produce it. So we're into economics here, and as everybody I'm sure has heard economics called the dismal science. It's a lot of guesswork. That's a lot of what I do is guessing. So yeah, complicated. Here in BC, we do have some standard leakage numbers that we use based on some work done by the provincial government and others. So that's useful. Now, obviously, if you're dealing, let's say, in replanting an eelgrass stand, you're probably not dealing with any leakage. In other words, there's no you replanting an eelgrass area isn't going to cause somebody else to damage one. So this doesn't apply to all types of projects. It typically does apply to forest projects. It can apply to grasslands projects and so on, but yeah. And then the buffer. So then the other problem we deal with in ecosystems, of course, is that it's not like putting the carbon into a block of carbon, putting it in a bank vault and leaving it there. Forests can burn, eelgrass beds can get damaged. And so there's always this risk that, yeah, we've saved a whole bunch of carbon on the landscape, but then it gets disappeared by one means or another. And so typically what we end up doing with that is doing some risk calculations, say, what is the risk of that? And we then put a buffer amount into a buffer pool. Ideally, that buffer pool is across a whole bunch of projects so that if 20 projects are done and one of them has an accident, the buffer credits from all the rest of them cover that off so that it's all good in terms of the atmosphere. Sometimes that buffer pool is a little bit undermanaged, as in BC was the case, I think, in some cases. But that's the idea. And so typically, again, there's some amount of your carbon that's going into a buffer to cover off for the risks because this is ecological carbon. Then we write the project plan or project document, or it gets called various things into various systems. But this is typically a big 100-page or more document laying out all this work that we've talked about up to date, demonstrating that's additional, detailing what the performance standards are going to be, what you're going to do if things change, et cetera, et cetera. It becomes a fairly massive document, but really lays out in detail your accounting procedures, your project, what you're going to do with the project, and so on. So it becomes your sort of master document for the project as a whole. Oops. Then you need to get that project plan validated. So that at this point, somebody from the outside who's an accredited auditor essentially has to come in, go over it, check all your assumptions, check your modeling, check the models you use, check all that kind of stuff, and say, does this make sense, or are you over accounting? And so this can be fairly complex because they typically come back. They typically do find some things where they go, I'm not quite sure you did it right, and you have to answer. So there's typically some back and forth here. And this can take a while, and it can be somewhat expensive because these auditors are not cheap. They obviously have to maintain their accreditation and so on. So, and like in the case of auditors that we've used, they often came from outside the country even. There's a lot of auditors down in the United States, more than there are here in Canada, that are accredited for this kind of stuff. And so, you know, this can be an expensive part. At that point, you're ready to actually do what you said you were going to do on the landscape. Now, you may have actually already started that. This carbon part can happen sort of in parallel with actually starting the real work on the landscape. It doesn't all have to happen first, but typically at this point, you're free and clear to get on with whether it's replanting the eelgrass or whether it's conserving the forest or whatever you're doing. As I say, it may already be underway, but you're doing the fun part at that point, which is really the part I think we're all interested in, which is, you know, saving and improving our ecosystems across British Columbia. At that point, you still, however, don't have any carbon offsets to sell, and that can be one of the problems here. Is that you don't get the carbon offsets until later, and so you need to be able to finance the project up front and then have that money come in to maintain and continue the project. Sometimes somebody might be willing to step in and donate that money, or not donate it, but provide it as finance in the early period. But ultimately speaking, you're going to have to finance that project to get it going. Then at some point, and this can depend on the project, it could be 1 year, or it could be 5 years, you get to the point where you say, okay, now we're going to actually count up all the actual offsets that we have created, and we're going to actually calculate what really happened. And keep in mind that early on, we calculated what we thought was going to happen with the project, but then we do the real thing and we actually ended up planting a bit more eelgrass, or we have a little fire, or the logging doesn't go as fast as we thought it would, or goes faster, or a million things can happen. So now we need to calculate the actual project carbon. In other words, what actually did we do on the landscape and what effect did it have? And so that's, you know, undoubtedly going to involve a lot of monitoring. If it's an eelgrass bed, you're going to be out there checking how well the eelgrass took and how well it's spreading to fill in the bed that you're working on. If it's a forest project, you're probably going to be out there measuring trees and so on. So, you know, there is a bunch of measurement at this point to say, are our models and everything we thought was going to happen real, or how do we have to change them? If you're really unlucky, the model you were using also has changed in the meantime, and now you have to go back and redo the baseline as well. That happened to us with the Jacquemus Community Forest. The Canada-wide carbon model had changed in the meantime, And it did change both our baseline and our project. So we had to recalculate everything at that point. Essentially, you take all of that recalculation plus a bunch of demonstration about what you've done, you sort of re-demonstrate that your additionality and leakage and so on are still realistic. And you put that into a project report, which is another sizable document, not as big as the first one, but basically that's the one that says how many carbon credits or offsets do we think that we've produced out of this project at that point in time. And that then again, now we have another auditor come in to verify that. And under many systems, it has to be a different auditor. So now you're hiring somebody else. So you can see by the time we've gotten to this, we're talking a fair amount of costs here to do all of this work. And that's one of the issues that we run into with this kind of a system. At that point, if the verification is completed, the verifier has verified it, then it goes into the registry. They typically review it. Typically, there aren't any problems, but there could be. And finally, at that point, you have carbon offsets to sell. And as I say at the bottom here, you still have to demonstrate all along that everything was conservative, that it didn't lead to an overestimation of the carbon benefits. Now, having gone through all of this rather painful process and rather expensive process, there's a part of me that's always a little bit like, could we make it any more complicated if we tried? The truth of the matter is that in order to safeguard having real benefits for the atmosphere, all of this is actually necessary. So despite my sometimes despairing sighs when I'm in the middle of one of these things, the reality is that this is all really important stuff, because this is where we demonstrate and prove that we actually are having a benefit for the atmosphere, for the carbon concentrations in the atmosphere. And that, after all, is the whole point of carbon credits. So again, here to restate again that the fact that we're doing something green for a forest or a eelgrass bed doesn't necessarily mean we're doing something good for the atmosphere. And so this whole process is where we demonstrate the linkage between the tree we planted and the atmosphere. So the question then becomes, okay, so we've done all that. Now, how much money are you going to get? Because obviously that's the goal of this in a way, is to be able to then finance more work, maintain the project, whatever the case may be. And unfortunately, I'm not going to give you a quick answer for that. It's going to depend on a huge number of factors. It's going to depend obviously on the biology of the site, how much this carbon is there, how much is going to get added, what you're doing is going to impact that. It's going to depend on some of the stuff we talked about, like leakage, harvested wood products, fools, risks, and big picture, it's going to depend on the price of carbon. And that's obviously a rapidly moving target now. We're seeing the price of carbon go up by leaps and bounds, really. And I think it's going to continue as people get serious, finally, about Paris and about meeting these targets. It's going to have to go up. So, the question of sort of where's the break-even point, how big a project do you have to have, is going to depend on all of these factors. And many small projects, as we'll realize, are probably never going to want to go through all of this on their own. It's going to be too expensive. So in general, to date, you need a pretty big project. Could be thousands of hectares of really carbon-rich old growth, or tens of thousands of hectares of improved management to justify going through all these steps. With a eelgrass bed, I'll talk about that more later, but I think you're going to have a monster project, and even then, I'm not sure. So there's the problem, in a sense, is that we need all of those steps in order to really demonstrate we're doing something for the atmosphere, but it means that we need big projects. And keep in mind, again, this is this ex post and ex ante language that gets used in this field. We don't get paid until the carbon is actually on site in any of the credible systems. In other words, it isn't like some people back 10 years ago were doing a project and saying, hey, I planted a bunch of trees, and those trees are going to capture some carbon in the future, so I get paid for it now. It doesn't work that way. So the question is, how do you deal with it if you're doing a small project that isn't going to get to that kind of scale? Well, one thing is to group together with a bunch of other projects, similar projects, to get scale. Some systems permit that. Sometimes it's really complicated. It's a possibility that if everybody, say in the Salish Sea, wanted to do eelgrass projects and everybody got together, there might be enough scale there to make it worthwhile to go through that process. Oh, now I've jumped out of the presentation. Sorry. Anyhow, that's more or less it. The other way to do this is to is to use a simpler standard. And we have the Green Community Standard in British Columbia. And that standard won't get you dollars, but what it will get you is credibility. It will get you offsets that your local municipality may be able to use. And those in and of themselves can be quite important for buy-in, for stakeholder buy-in, and so on. So despite the fact that you may not be producing money with a lesser standard, it may still be really important in terms of how a project gets buy-in and exists within a community. So for small projects, I would sort of suggest that that's the first thing you think about. Now, again, the Green Community Standard doesn't, for instance, have a way of measuring eelgrass, so that won't apply to every project, but yeah. That's it. I'm afraid I haven't left much time for questions. I thought I'd get through that faster, but there you go.
I have saved, thank you so much, everybody. And Robert, we're going to be cut off in a moment, but I'm saved the questions and we'll address them and then we'll send them out and post them on the Transition Salt Spring website. So they will, and we've had fantastic people answering the questions. There's one, Robert, about eelgrass, how it can be a long-term, how it can be used for long-term carbon storage calculations, which I'll launch to you so that on the panel, you'll have a chance to address that one.
I will be talking about that, yes.
Super. So thank you, everyone. I think we can leave the breakout and go back to the main meeting. Thank you so much, Robert, and thank you, everyone, for your excellent participation.